Some political watchers are saying this could be the nastiest, most negative election season of all time.
This campaign season seems like candidates have taken dirty to a whole new level.
When pundits start shouting and politicians start calling each other's names, it can seem like a return to civility is not possible. Like the very idea is a relic of some bygone era.
John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy in America?
I'm Thomas Jefferson, and I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character with neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
If Thomas Jefferson wins, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John Adams, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
The nastiest, most negative election.
Candidates have taken dirty to a whole new level.
It can seem like a return to civility is not possible.
I don't think I ever said that to you, Mr. Adams.
I know that I never said any of that directly to you, Mr. Jefferson. No,
I don't think I ever approved of any messages like that. It seemed like that they were attributing those words to me.
Oh, and likewise to myself. I fear that what was said was not necessarily anything that either of us would have said directly to the other, regardless of any opinions. Perhaps what was said about Hamilton, but that is another story for another time, of course.
Mr. Hamilton, yes, is a very different story, isn't he?
Yes, indeed. One we should possibly not discuss in polite company. But
good point, Mr. Adams.
Yeah.
We did have our differences in 1800, and the country was on the brink of a civil war, but I dare say I was never uncivil to you. There were some comments I made regarding you. I did express in writing that I disagreed with you and with George Washington, and a few of those expressions of my honest disagreements with you made their way to the public. I did not mean them to.
Yes, of course. There is always the danger of writing things down whence that someone will actually read them.
Well, I think you and I would both agree, Mr. Adams, the conversation you have in your own home can be of a very different sort without intruding upon your integrity than the kind of conversation you are required to have, the limitations you have, the responsibilities you have with a conversation that is public. If someone says, well, he doesn't talk that way when he's home alone or just among his friends, that's hardly a criticism. That's actually, to me, a compliment that they have enough self-control to know the appropriate environment has the appropriate conversation.
Indeed, when you are amongst you and your fireside, you have the opportunity to speak gratefully with with those of your family, and I am very pleased that I had a fine partner in Abigail that I could actually speak my mind about such things, and she could help anchor my concerns and keep me from saying anything untoward. For the possibility of saying anything that would anger someone was, well, it was a very strong possibility with me, as you well know, Mr. Jefferson.
That being acknowledged, Mr. Adams, we must admit to our friends here that we did get angry at each other, but we didn't stoop to name calling or to lying about each other. Now, I do know that I funded newspapers, and I did not control the editors or publishers of the newspapers. Some of them said things that I would have rather they not said about you. I admit that. Some of the quotes that were attributed to me in there were to some of those authors. I apologize because I did not think it was appropriate for a member of the government to control the press.
Well, I thank you for that. That is very kind of you. Of course, I dare say, so reaped what you might have unintentionally sowed later on as Mr. Callender continued to write untoward things of your character at another time. But as regards the election of 1800, of course, it was scarcely within our control to say what was said. Those who were convinced that we should be the president, or either of us should be the president in their respective parties, of course, began to take it upon themselves to write rather untoward things of the other.
We never even went out and asked for votes. I mean, it would have been considered ungentlemanly. It would have been considered not only ungentlemanly, but people would have looked at us askance and probably been convinced to vote against us had we traveled around the country trying to convince them to vote for. I never left Monticello throughout the campaign, as you might call it, for the election of 1800.
And I was scarcely between Washington City and my home in Massachusetts, and that was very well by myself. I was very happy to be so. And of course, it would not be befitting a person of such an office to go and beg out upon the streets for people to approve of you for their votes. No, that was to be held, of course, in our time with the electors. And of course, the difficulty there lay in the fact that the electors could not seem to agree amongst themselves. The Federalists were factioned amongst themselves. And of course, the Democratic Republicans had no great control. Well, you seemed to have an idea of it, but I dare say it did not hold fast, did it?
Well, I think it would have been intrusive, just as I didn't control James Callender's printing in the newspaper. It would have been not just ungentlemanly for us to travel about the country asking for votes, but it would have been intruding on the judgment, the good judgment of the American people. That's why we stayed home, allowed them to learn as they would, to decide on their own. We continued with either our duties in government or our private lives. That being said, you're right. The 1800 things were nearly disastrous. We were on the brink of a civil war.
Oh, yes. Well,
although that wasn't your fault. That was Aaron's fault.
Well, no, we were certainly, of course, already beginning. When I began the presidency, I received the gift of political parties and, of course, a near war with France, and neither of which put anyone in a particularly congenial mood, if you will.
Well, you brought up congenial moods, Mr. Adams. I must admit that though we never said anything particularly to offend each other, no insults thrown, you did do one thing that personally I found personally offensive, Mr. Adams.
Offensive, sir?
I did. I took it to heart when, in your last moments in office, in a great rush, knowing that the voice of the American people was in the balance, and knowing that your time in office was through, you rushed to your duties. Yes, I understand they were duties to appoint members to the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court Justice, who became the Chief Justice of the United States.
Yes.
I thought that this was forcing your hand. You should have allowed some dignity, allowed the possibility for the voice of the American people to step in to decide who should fill those seats, and then allow your successor, if you were voted out of office, to fill the seats instead of you, in respect to the voice of the American people.
Well, that is a lovely sentiment, of course. You realize that in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, there is no grand design for understanding when office should be filled. It when the opportunity arises. It is not a question of taking time to wait for the approval of the people. The people have chosen their electors, their leaders, their representatives, and thusly, when the opportunity presents itself that we should fill an office of the judiciary, we should do so. It is not in our understanding
you passed the laws after the results of the election were known, and then you filled the seats in just a few weeks at the end of your term. I think that was pushing that logic a little too far, Mr. Adams.
Well, I simply was attempting to get done what needed to get done. And if you were when you were in Washington City, I'm sure you understood that there was precious little else to do but one's job.
Well, I have another question for you, Mr. Adams.
Actually, you have a question for me, sir?
Regarding our jobs.
Yes.
Once the results of the election were known, or at least it was known that you were not going to be president for a second term. This was in February, of course. after the week-long balloting over the electoral tie between Aaron Burr and myself, which
Oh, yes,
a lot
of
of
course.
running, you could have spoken up for the more civil of the two candidates, for the one that was the obvious choice of the American people, myself, and against the man who was clearly trying to undermine the democratical systems that we had fought so hard over the previous decade and a half to establish under the Constitution. And yet you remained silent. You wouldn't speak out for in any way that would have helped to keep the Constitution from being pushed over the brink and ruining our experiment in democracy. Why didn't you do that?
I dare say it was not my place to do so, sir. The power, of course, was within your own grasp. You had the ability to seek compromise, which was what founded this country in essence, a great deal of compromise. And you had the opportunity to explain your position and your promises to electors were you to be elected. And I believe that it should have been you who would have been able to offer that compromise, and thusly you could have ensured 34 elections or 33 elections, perhaps, instead of, but perhaps even 3. But no, you would not make yourself clear for the good of compromise. You would allow yourself to let this trial and error continue itself unabated.
Well, Mr. Adams, perhaps we have reached an impasse in that particular element of the discussion, but you did mention the idea of compromise, and I think we would be doing a disservice to our colleagues and our friends who are listening in on our conversation if we were not to perhaps give a few specifics about the ways we did disagree and how the American people decided they wanted to take sides. After all, in the 2 years, especially leading up to the election of 1800, there have been protests in the streets, mobs, violence, even threats against your own life.
Of course, it was dangerous, of course, and people were, well, uncertain as to how we would proceed as a country. It was, as I had feared numerous times, that our differing states were developing separate personalities and were becoming separate characters of their own and were becoming harder and harder to find agreement, which is one of the reasons I believed that a strong central government was necessary for everyone to agree to have this certain amount of federal central governance and thusly work together and to actually create a nation of states rather than a spate of states. And I believe it was most important to do so. But of course, I think even when the Constitution was established, no one could imagine the strong leanings into two separate camps of those who would believe that federal government was a higher priority than those who believed that state government was necessary. And thusly, it turned into blind factions, arguing amongst themselves and completely ignoring the people that they were governing and completely ignoring the arguments of the opposing side simply because they were coming from the opposing side.
I would tend to disagree in a general sense, though I do agree with you that there were some people who had taken their faction to be their God and their country nothing. And if it weren't their faction, then it was their profit based on the Hamiltonian system of banking. He set up a system that undermined our very tenets of our Constitution by encouraging those who were representatives of the people to profit, use their offices for personal profit. Nothing but corruption can come from that, and the kind of corruption that would undermine our Constitution. However, I don't think that those who formed the groundswell of support for the Democratic Republicans in 1800 were blind factionalists. I think they had fundamental differences with the way the country was headed. I think that the argument, first of all, I don't think the argument that one side wanted the states to have all the power and the general government nothing is, I disagree with you in that framing of the argument. That is not the argument that I made, nor is it the argument made by those who voted for me. My argument was that the more problems you send to the general government, the national government to solve, the more control you give the general government over your life. But really, most questions are local questions. And the local governments are closest to the ear of the people, so they can listen to the problems. And the local governments are closest to the eye of the people, so the people can watch over them. So you avoid corruption by funneling the majority of the decisions to the local governments, leaving in the national government those decisions that are within its authority, within its bailiwick. And you also prevent the governors from feeling as though no one's watching over them.
Well, far be it from me, woman, to engage with or interrupt a man back in your time, but I have to insist and be grateful to our presidents Jefferson and Adams and welcome everybody more formally to this Why America, toward a more perfect union, finding hope in America's story in troubled times. I hope all of our participants, teachers, and others out there have been enjoying this little vignette from our presidents who are going to be with us for the rest of the time. Why do we do this? We're about to get started with the more interactive part of the program, and Messrs. Jefferson and Adams will stay with us. But we wanted to show and help you make the connection between not just the troubled times that we're finding today, but the fact that we are a history of an experiment and troubled times. And we come out of it, and to do what we can to help you guide your students in the coming days and weeks. And so without further ado, let me ask the gentleman to stay on and bring on our expert panel. First, Jeff Sakinga, who's the Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, the educational center on the campus of Ashland University. Welcome, Jeff. Their AmericanHistory.org website and online teaching and master's programs with Kara Rogers to his right, Assistant Professor of History at Ashland, have been incredibly just resilient and helpful for teachers all across the country. And they've written quite a bit about this subject. And so we've invited them to talk a little bit about how to bring life to this issue for students. And I'd also, to that end, like to invite our educator panel. First, Christine Ivey, the superintendent at Heritage Academy in Jerome, Idaho. Welcome, Christine. And Lauren Staton, our friend and fearless leader of the history department at Washington Latin Charter School in Washington, D.C. And so what you're going to see, ladies and gentlemen, for the next little while is Jeff and Kara, our academic and expert panel, are going to talk about these issues in more detail. The presidents are going to see if they agree. And Christine and Lawrence, our educators, are going to help make sure this is accessible for all of you who are in the classroom every day. And so I'll be back in a little while, but let me hand it over to Jeff. Thank you so much for coming. And again, thank you all for being with us. Please keep your comments coming in the chat, and we'll do what we can to get to any questions. And more information, as you know, will be available at whyamerica.edreform.com. So see you in a bit. Thanks again.
Well, thank you very much for having us. Really do appreciate it. So delighted to be on this panel with so many distinguished guests, including Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams. Delighted that they could join us. Mr. Jefferson will be delighted to know that I matriculated at his university. So I may be in the Jefferson camp as this goes. But
might I extend to you the greeting, Dr. Sakinga, wahua.
Wahua, exactly. This is this election so ably represented by Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams here. I think it does behoove us to take a look at history and to see that some questions remain really permanent questions. And one of the questions that both Mr. Adams and Mr. Jefferson alluded to, and I think is so essential when talking about contemporary elections like the election of 2020, is to remind students that we've seen these things before in our country, and that there are certain permanent questions. Questions like, can the people really govern themselves? And while there may have been significant differences in policy and perhaps opinion between Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams in that election of 1800, both men as they would themselves acknowledge, and as I'm no doubt they may talk about later, in fact, as they came back in their adult life in their later years, to a great friendship and correspondence between the two of them, because they did both share that spirit of 76, that commitment to the idea of self-government that forged the country in those tumultuous years of the revolution. And whatever differences divided them in the 1790s, what's wonderful to see from the election of 1800 and on, to me, is how that spirit of self-government, those principles of self-government that they shared, were stronger than the partisan divides that developed in the 1790s. And I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves and our students of what those fundamental principles are that united Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson once called it, and Mr. Jefferson would know, he described it in 1825 in a letter as the Declaration of Independence as an expression of the American mind, that these two men had an American mind. And the question is, what are the principles in that American mind that united them and that held them together and the country together despite that great division? So I would say that's an important question for us to think about and for us to address with our students, and to go back then to something like the Declaration of Independence, as Jefferson called it, the Revolution of 1800, to complete the revolution begun in 1776, but to go back to those principles and go back to those documents that articulate those principles, to understand that common shared American mind. And therefore, I think to help understand why the debate was so vehement, because each side believed perhaps that the other had maybe lost a bit of that understanding of the American mind that they shared. So I would just throw that out there to begin. I know Professor Rogers has spent her academic career studying Thomas Jefferson and his thought, and including the election of 1800.
Yes, hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm especially honored to meet the presidents for the first time. It's a real dream come true for me, I must say. Jeannie asked me if I would just quickly throw it over to Christine and to Lawrence and ask you both to say hello and see if there was anything that you wanted to add at this point in the conversation. So Christine, perhaps you can go first.
Hi, I echo your comments. It's a pleasure to meet both President Adams and Mr. Jefferson. And it's really a pleasure to hear your discussion rather than the videos and propaganda that seems like it's been so common in the newspapers and in discussions that I hear amongst parents and students at the school that I work at. So I would be curious to hear your suggestions about how to help our students and our parents and the common citizens really understand the differences between your perspectives and the impact that those differences would have on our country moving forward.
Well, Mr. Adams, if I may, first of all, thank you all for presenting these ideas to us. If I may, the reason why I began to disagree with Mr. Adams, we had been working so close together in the 1770s and the early 1780s, but in the 90s we began to split apart, was that I began to sense from some of the writings of Mr. Adams that he was a proponent of looking backward instead of forward for what was best in mankind. And I believe that the idea encapsulated by all men are created equal is inherently a forward-looking concept. All men are created equal. The men means mankind. So, ladies, you too. Acknowledging the fact that I was born a slave owner and depended on slaves all my life when Mr. Adams didn't. While that is a paradox, it doesn't undermine the validity of all men are created equal. We expanded the franchise through our Revolutionary War and our Constitution. Mr. Adams and I couldn't have voted for the highest offices in the land when we were young. We expanded it to men. They were white. They had to be landowners. Eventually, they didn't have to be landowners, but they could vote for the highest offices in the land. That took a war and bloodshed to get that far. It got to the point, though, we had to solidify what we had gained in our generation. I believe the next step then was for our generation who had established those gains, to begin to prepare the next generation to move what we had accomplished beyond what we could have dreamed or even understood. The sense I got, Mr. Adams, and I will turn to you for your response on this, was that you believed the wisdom we should turn to should weigh more toward looking back to the ancients, to the wisdom of those who had come before us, whereas I focused on those who had come after us and empowering them.
Well, it is an interesting supposition, and I would say that while I do appreciate the learning from the past, of course, as a foundation, and I believe in the need for a strong foundation for us to govern and to learn and to educate, but I also believe that it is necessary that we should indeed be looking forward, but I believe that we must also look forward in a longer view to realize that these dreams that you speak of, I fear, will not happen immediately, that they will not begin until hundreds of generations beyond us. I thought that certain things such as a true freedom of speech or a true freedom of the press might never exist within our lifetimes or our great-grandchildren's lifetime, but that it would eventually find its way in 100, 200, 300 years. But of course, it was my belief that we should work towards that improvement. But as I stated before, during my time in the Continental Congress, America is a slow, unwieldy body, and its progress must be slow. And I fear nothing was more evident than the time that we spent in government, that progress would come in moments, but they would be slight, and they would be offset, if you will, by many other wandering and stalwart and rather stubborn mule-like grazers, rather than actual forward stallions roaming forward. No, I fear that while I believe that looking forward is helpful, looking backward to see what happened and how it happened and how we might improve upon that is a fine thing. But I believe that we should look forward, but it would be a much longer view than looking to our children to immediately approve upon what we
see there. I think we disagree starkly, because I think we should have a constitutional convention every generation, and specifically one that empowers the generation that is coming onto the stage.
Oh, here we are again.
To change the Constitution, and does not allow the generation that is leaving the stage to hold them back. Every generation should have a constitutional convention, but it should be for that generation to decide.
And as my wife said, all men would be tyrants if they could. And if we are to simply abandon all prospects of what we began with and then start over, it would...
I didn't say abandon them. Now you're putting words in my mouth. I said they should throw away what doesn't work anymore, keep the things that still work. But I'm sure by the generation of those who are listening now, they could probably find one or two things in the Constitution that they think are outdated and worse than useless, are actually holding them back. Well, I say they get rid of them, but don't get rid of the whole thing.
I say simply amend it and allow them to take care from there. But I believe, sir, this could continue us on far beyond our own time. And
we've been arguing about this for about 200 years now. I suppose it could.
Yes, I suppose that we should allow others to continue onward without our own interruption.
What I love about listening to this conversation is that I think it reminds us that the founding fathers did not have one particular singular view of the nature of humans. Mr. Jefferson's perspective on mankind is very optimistic, believing that individuals can improve themselves over time and that America can become more and more free and more moral. Whereas Mr. Adams maybe had a little bit more of a pessimistic view of humankind. It led him to be a little bit more cautious in the way that he approached government, and maybe even a little bit more trusting of central government's role in taking care of the American people and pushing the American people in the right direction, whereas Mr. Jefferson would have preferred to allow more democracy and allow the people more of a role in their own self-government. And this kind of brings us back to the central crux of the election of 1800, this huge dispute over what is going to be the role of the central government. And maybe a good illustration of this is the Alien and Sedition Acts, Mr. Adams, that you signed, maybe something that you look back on with a little bit of regret. Maybe you can talk about that later, but the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, in which the federal government gave the president power to essentially censor speech that criticized his administration, that criticized Congress. And Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison pushed back against this with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing that perhaps the federal government shouldn't be the ones getting to decide how much power they have over themselves when it comes to a constitutional crisis. Perhaps the states have more of a role to play in making sure that, that the federal government doesn't overstep its bounds. Some of these conflicts might sound familiar to people in the audience today. We've always had this tension between what do we do when there's a constitutional crisis? Who should be the final arbiter of that? How much power do we trust the federal government to have? How much do we want to leave in the hands of the states? And what's the role of free speech? Even at a dangerous time like the time where we have a quasi-war with France, do we trust the American people to say the wrong thing freely and trust that the truth will point us in the right direction in the end? Or do we believe that we need to have a sedition policy preventing individuals from criticizing the government? So Dr. Sekenga, I don't know if you want to jump back in here and share some more of your thoughts.
Well, I would love to hear the thoughts of Mr. Adams and Mr. Jefferson on that topic of the Alien and Sedition Acts and what role they thought it played in creating the difficult divided climate of the election of 1800.
I will do my best to be brief, which is scarcely my easiest suit. But I will simply say that in the time of our young nation, that the newspapers and pamphlets and other papers, other publications were being distributed in ways without any basis in fact. Wild accusations were being thrown about, and as they would not be immediately refutable, it would take time for a repudiation to actually make its way from the author to the papers where they would be originated. That it was not the easiest thing to keep lies from becoming seeming truth. And while I did not author the laws themselves, I thought it was important to ensure that that they should be watched over, and unlike state sedition laws, that the opportunity to present truth as a defense, to present the facts as a defense for one's authorship, was a very important thing. And of course, I will also say that, yes, there were complaints against such things. And I will say that while my personal opinions were not used in the arrest of those who wrote falsehoods, that of course others took the cause from the sedition law and prosecuted many who they believed were writing libelous and scandalous things, and some of them were not as scandalous as their punishments would seem to appear. I will also say that, of course, the protests from Mr. Madison and Mr. Jefferson, while strong and receiving some support, that they did not reflect the entirety of the people, and they were not pursued into an actual law, and they were not pursued into anything further than writings. And of course, the support for sedition law continued. My own wife would have much happier been if the sedition law were even stricter. But of course, I believe that there was a good middle ground, if you will, achieved by it. But it was.
I would have to disagree with you on the idea.
Of course you would, Mr. Jefferson.
That they're anything like compromise. They were flatly unconstitutional. Nothing in the Constitution allowed the federal government to restrict the press whatsoever, and specifically in the First Amendment, it was prohibited to do so. That power was left to the states, as far as the states had slander laws and libel laws, and specifically prohibited, even with the truth as a defense, from the president, from the general government, from exercising it. And as far as the Alien Acts, the Constitution also specifically stated that each state should be allowed to import or immigrate individuals as they saw fit. It danced around the idea of slavery, but it meant anyone that a state decided could allow them to immigrate within the state would be allowed. And the Alien Acts flatly went against the Constitution on that as well. So I didn't take it personally like I did with Supreme Court appointments, but I think you broke the Constitution there, sir.
I would simply say that, you will never be truly content with all of my actions, Mr. Jefferson.
Nor you with mine.
No, that is also very true, Mr. Jefferson. But perhaps
we have been requested also to invite. There has been, I didn't see. It's very difficult to see everybody in this format. There is a Dr. I think Staten, who is also here, that I had not realized was. It's unusual to have a conversation. We're not used to it, where you can't see everybody who's in the room with you.
Yes, yes. It is peering into a number of windows where there's no one on the other side.
Yes, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to meet both of you. I'm a civics teacher in Washington City, as Mr. Adams would say. My sixth grade students greatly admire your principled stand in the Continental Congress, Mr. Adams, for the Declaration of Independence. They're huge fans of your work. And they also appreciate, Mr. Jefferson, your right of revolution and the consent of the governed you laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But one of the things they do struggle with, and since we're talking about elections, if we believe in democratic principles, one of the things they struggle with is this idea of the Electoral College, which created so much controversy in the election of 1800. So what would you say to a sixth grader about why the Electoral College is fair? I mean, it would seem that the fairest thing, since, Mr. Jefferson, you are very much a believer in the will of the people, whoever gets the most votes wins. Wouldn't that just be a simpler solution than dividing the country into red states and blue states? Whoever just gets the most votes and, the will of the people, wouldn't that just be a fairer system?
I would I would first turn and commend any of you said sixth graders. So very young, not a term we used in my day, but very young students. Any student of that age who would make that point, first I would commend them, and that I would say, you're the living generation. Those who created the Constitution are not. If you think what we created is unfair, you should change it. You should not look to us as if we are your masters and you are our slaves from beyond the grade to do everything the way we used to do it. The earth belongs to the living, not the dead. Now, the reason why we did it at first, and I think Mr. Adams would agree, and I did agree with the temporary need for it, was because the American people weren't educated enough to handle that much direct power yet.
Indeed.
As the people become more educated, they can handle more power.
Yes, and that is, of course, one of the greatest difficulties is a lack of education. I strongly believed that education was important so that future generations, whether that be 5 or 10 or 20 generations further down, that they would be able to know more clearly the reasons why they should elect one person over another, that they should have reasoned understanding, and that they would be able to create an educated vote. In our day, it was very difficult, and many of our people did not have an understanding of the full approaches of the government and how we should actually choose appropriate people. I believed in time that would be something that would be shifted away from. I presumed that, of course, it has been a good 12, 15 generations that you are possibly away from the Electoral College by now, if not at least discussing it.
Well, actually, considering the passage of time that you mentioned, perhaps some of our other experts, the other members of the panel here might be able to comment with more foresight than our 1826 limitations
There is
might
that,
press upon
yes.
us
After
with this question.
1826, things do become a bit hazy.
We can open the floor to our fellow moderators. Yes.
Well, I think that's a wonderful question. It is remarkable, as Mr. Jefferson said, that it's sixth graders raising such a question. They obviously have a fine teacher cultivating their thinking. Well, of course, we have had situations, even recently, as we all know, where the winner of the popular vote is not the winner of the Electoral College. I would say one thing for us to remember and to remind our students of this, which is that it's a national government. As Mr. Madison said in Federalist number 39, the government is partly national and partly federal. And it's a national union, but also a federal union of states. And of course, within each state, the Electoral College is democratic. If the winner takes all in that state, or by congressional district, as it is in a few states, the winner of a popular vote does in fact take the electoral votes of that state. So within the state, the people of the state, or the people of the United States in that state, do decide democratically for the vote. So I don't think we should simply think about the presidential election simply in terms of the national union, but also the union as partly national and partly federal, doing justice to the distinct character of the different states. After all, Massachusetts and Virginia are distinct places and continue to be distinct places even in 2020.
And I would only add to that Mr. Jefferson very famously had concerns about the differences between rural parts of America and the cities of America. And one way that the Electoral College serves rural parts of America is by making sure that even less populated areas must be catered to and reached by any of our presidential candidates. If the Electoral College did not exist, then our presidential candidates would simply campaign in the biggest cities in order to collect the most votes. But because of the Electoral College, they must go to more rural areas. They must reach wide varieties of individuals in America and appeal to many different constituents' needs in order to collect the electoral votes that are necessary for a win.
I would like to add to that notion that, of course, Dr. Rogers was someone who knows me at least as well as I know myself and what you said. But I would add to it by saying that though that is true as far as it goes, when the Electoral College was placed into the Constitution, it was not to protect the rural areas from the great and large cities, because not only were the cities very small, but as you would put it, our expectations of demographic shift were all that the populations would leave the cities, because why would you stay in a city and live in a building someone else owned and work in a factory that someone else, a brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, owned, and worry about it when you could have an acre and feed your family and a flintlock and protect yourself and be the master of your own property. So we actually expected the population to shift to the country. Georgia, in the Constitutional Convention, though it was a sparsely populated state, voted consistently with the states that had the biggest cities and the bigger population, because they expected, with all that land they had in the West, to become one of the biggest states, not in the cities, but in the rural areas. So the Electoral College was not placed there to protect, originally, to protect the rural areas from the urban areas. If that has become a situation in your day, it is beyond our predictions.
And I believe that simply when you say some of us believe people would move to the countries, I believe you're referring to you. Because if those of us who have been to Philadelphia and Boston know that far too many people have decided to cramp themselves into tight quarters.
Well, Georgia did.
A home.
The entire state. That's why they voted with it. There wasn't a north-south split in a lot of ways when it comes to those votes in the Constitutional Convention, because a number of those states with a lot of Western land that was unpeopled voted with the larger states because they expected. Of course, I wasn't there, I admit, but I've been talking with Mr. Madison a lot, since he no longer has to keep the events secret from that summer.
Yes, you Virginians do have a way of talking to one another more directly. Yes, so please let us continue onward.
Could I raise another question that perhaps some of Mr. Statton's students in his class would have raised, and this may dishearten Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams, but Mr. Hamilton has become a celebrity in our day. They're writing musicals about him, portraying him sympathetically as a great man and essential to the founding and success and flourishing of this country. I would love to hear your opinions, both of you, on Alexander Hamilton. And of course, we're talking about the election of 1800, Aaron Burr, who, you may be surprised, is featured, and again, quite sympathetically, in this great musical production as one of the main characters there, Hamilton and Burr.
This conversation is venturing into territory that would make me wish to engage more in my study of viticulture and oenology than I otherwise would, but of course I'll use those words for it in the presence of 6th graders. Well, I think, Mr. Adams, you and I, to a great degree, actually agree on our condemnation of Alexander Hamilton, not maybe for the same reasons. I disagree with him about his stance on the power of federal government, whereas it seems your disagreement with him is personal. And I'm not sure where you stand on the character of Aaron Burr, but I learned the hard way not to trust Aaron Burr. Well, actually, no. Alexander Hamilton learned the hard way about Aaron Burr. I learned the second hardest way about Aaron Burr.
Yes, that would be quite true, Mr. Jefferson. I would simply say that while I hold there was no coolness between Mr. Hamilton and myself, I would dare say that there was no hotness either. I certainly held my own opinions of Mr. Hamilton, including, while they were opinions of a somewhat of a personal nature, they were, of course, harbored in facts. And as I have said before, facts are stubborn things. And the fact that this man who believed in federal principles, and many of which that I thought were also appropriate, also seemed to think it necessary to make sure votes were withdrawn from my potential election in each election that I was being considered for the presidency. In all of them, votes were taken away from me. One to keep from embarrassing General Washington with too close of a vote. It was 63 to 34, or 69 to 34. Yes, that was not he who needed to be embarrassed. But of course, Mr. Hamilton continued in 1796 and 1800 that I would dare say he would have preferred even Mr. Burr over myself. He certainly would have preferred
Actually,
Mr.
the
Pinckney.
strange thing is, and I think a lot of the students of our teachers here would agree, that Mr. Burr, actually, I would posit that just as Mr. Hamilton did in the case when it came down to Aaron Burr and myself, he would do for you as well, Mr. Adams, that while he wrote that extensive letter criticizing you, if it came down to Aaron Burr and you, he would do as he did with me, which is to say, it was a bit of a backhanded compliment, where he said, well, Mr. Jefferson may have misguided principles, but at least he has principles. You see, and this is where, though Mr. Hamilton and I disagree fundamentally, he believes you can't trust the common people. I believe you can trust them if you educate them, and therefore it is the responsibility of the government to educate them. And you and I, Mr. Adams, agree on that notion. So,
indeed,
Mr. Hamilton and I, though, also agreed that when it comes down to a decision about who is going to hold the reins of power the United States, if you have two choices, and one is someone maybe you disagree with their principles, but you know they're a principled person, you know they strive to be honest and a public servant, and the other person is a person who, I think Mr. Hamilton used the term for Aaron Burr, described him as totally bankrupt, not financially, but in his lack of faith to his country, morally bankrupt, and bankrupt in his patriotism, someone with no principles, someone with no sense of honesty, no sense of loyalty, someone who is only reaching for that power for his own sake, to enrich himself and his family, to bring power to himself, and to bring glory to himself. Mr. Hamilton, he threw his vote to me, and he supported me. I think he would have done the same if it had been between Aaron Burr and yourself as well, because he knew that you had principles. He just thought that you applied them in the wrong way.
Well, I dare say that Mr. Hamilton, of course, was a very crafting and guiling man. In his lovely letter that he wrote that explained every problem with me, with my poor character, with my poor decisions, with my poor understanding of power, after page of such scathing descriptions, he then proceeded to write at the end that still not one vote should be held against me. I believe this is the 18th century equivalent of what you attendees in your day would call a just kidding sort of comment. And unfortunately, it was felt just as poorly and did not really receive that fine effort.
Along the lines of jesting and not taking things seriously, I'm glancing at questions being placed by passenger pigeon upon our tabletops here.
Yes, yes.
And one of them is, there are two that have come up, and one that speaks to an area in which you have a great deal of strength, Mr. Adams, because it speaks to a letter that seems to have made its way public that Mrs. Adams wrote. I don't know why people are going through her mail, but apparently they are. And the other one is a question that I think would be very relevant as well to our discussion. Before I, though, would dive into those, I would want to again turn to our fellow panelists.
Yes.
In the 18th century, people would give speeches for hours on end.
Yes, and of course, as
but we don't want to stand in your way for also adding your wisdom.
Yes, our time is not at the same lack of limits as yours, Pat. Yes.
Karen.
Well, I would just jump in and ask a question before our time is up of all of our panelists, our teachers with us, Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Adams, Dr. Rogers, which is when we look back at an election like the election of 1800, it's wonderful to re-immerse ourselves in that and get back in that and talk with the past and meet with the past and discuss with the past. But a larger question that has been raised by those in attendance is this question of why study history? What do we get out of it? And I'd love to hear what the teachers with us have to say. I'd love to hear what Mr. Adams and Mr. Jefferson and Dr. Rogers have to say about why study history and something like the election of 1800, that it's not simply something that is in a museum for us to visit, but somehow is relevant and important for us.
If I could just jump in here and say a couple of great questions have been popping up about why study history. And one person asked, how should we study history? Not just using musicals and political cartoons, although I am a huge fan of using bits and pieces of musicals sometimes in my classes. But how can we teach history and how do we make it relevant, especially around touchy issues? I think going back to the words of Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams and other historical figures, reading their letters, reading their speeches, reading primary documents is the best way to learn history, in my opinion. And it's the best way even for young students to learn history, because then they get to ask the difficult questions directly to the people who had to live through those situations. And students can learn how to try to understand difficult issues from the perspectives of those who had to live them. And it teaches students how to have a respectful dialogue with individuals that they don't agree with, perhaps, that they have to, maybe they agree with Mr. Jefferson's perspective, but if they have to read Mr. Adams's letters and they have to try to understand why he believes what he believes, this helps students to learn how to have respectful conversations, how to be part of a civic dialogue, how to see things from another person's point of view, how to have compassion and empathy for somebody else's situation. So my answer would be primary documents, and I'll open it up to everybody else.
If I may jump in on Dr. Rogers' point, I think one of the important things for teaching history is to make sure students understand what a compelling story this actually is. And when you connect to students on an emotional level and you get them to understand and invest in not only just, Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Adams, and Mr. Hamilton, but you get them to invest in the work that they did and understand why it's so important, and you connect it to them on an emotional level. Students become more connected to it. I've found that, in my educational practice, students develop a sense of empathy when they connect to it on an emotional level. And so that would be my answer. Make students understand what a compelling story the United States is.
And if I may continue upon that, actually, to encapsulate a number of different things that Mr. Jefferson mentioned, that our fine professors have mentioned, I will say that, of course, first of all, I well knew that letters would not be left private. Private letters of public officials are seldom private. And of course, I will also say that we knew that in many ways that our letters would be read by preceding generations, succeeding citizens of the United States. And I wrote my letters knowing that they would be in public view. I would say that, of course, as a number of ideas that I put forward refer to things which may be 200 or more years out of the usual understanding of your day's students and possibly educators, that anything with a bit of footnoting would be a very fine assist to ensuring that some of the more obscure references which I make to Peloponnesian Wars and the whatnot might be better understood. But I will also say that in the importance of history, that our lives were ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. I was a farmer who became a lawyer because he would not become a minister, and still returned to farming throughout his life. And yet I was still given an opportunity, a command, if you will, from the people to serve. And I knew it was my necessity to serve for the good of ensuring liberty for people of our own day and beyond. And within the course of our lifetimes, in addition to ensuring this more perfect union, we were also ensuring that food was upon the table, that families were cared for, that livestock were tended to, that cities were grown, and that that our lives would still be fulfilling, and that we would have life. Life and history happens in the midst of ordinary and extraordinary times. It is what you learn to do with your life that is important, and looking to people in extraordinary circumstances and ordinary ones, making choices that make a difference. There is the importance of history, I believe.
I would first say yes to everything that everybody has said so far, because what I'm about to say would almost seem like I'm going to disagree with you, but I'm saying this adding to what you've all said. To this question of utmost importance, when asked by a student, why should I care? Who cares? Why? I think it is essential for anyone, be it Mr. Adams and myself, when we speak to students, anyone who is taking on that burden of teaching, to avoid the temptation to try to tell them why they are supposed to care. As soon as we start doing that, you have to do this, or why they are supposed to respect me, or why they are supposed to respect George Washington, or respect anything, then I think we fall into a trap, because students, any person with a free mind, which means any person with a mind that is not so damaged as to not be able to think, any person will recoil at that, be they sixth graders or someone who's come to their majority. We should start by finding out what they care about. And speaking to that, like Dr. Statton had mentioned earlier as one example. To that end, then, I would say that one of the uses of studying history acknowledges that they may study, for instance, me, and condemn aspects of my life, decisions I made or failed to make, and let them know that I encourage them in that activity of judging even me, especially me. But here's why. This is not me with some kind of a mea culpa or condemning myself. They have a responsibility to judge, to exercise, to judge. And if you're going to judge, you must understand. If you're going to understand those you're going to judge, you must learn about them. You must judge those who've come before you. Because one day, you, the living generation, will be judged by those who come after you. And they're not going to praise you for the accomplishments of the generations that came before you. So for instance, if your students are born in an America where slavery is illegal, they're never going to be praised for not owning slaves. I was born a slave owner, but for your students to own slaves, they'd have to break the law. So if they learn to understand, and I'm not excusing myself here, but my point is, the more they understand the specifics of those historical situations that they will come to condemn by justifiably exercising their educated judgment, they will train themselves to look for those challenges in their lifetime. Dare I say, their slavery. Slavery was the challenge that defeated my generation. We overcame some challenges. What are the they will train themselves to look for those templates in their lifetime, that they will be judged 200 years from their lifetime as to whether or not they succeeded in overcoming them, as we did with introducing democracy to America, or if they failed in overcoming them, as we failed with we failed to end slavery.
Well, thank you so much, panelists. Those are wonderful words of insight and inspiration for us. Thank you so much for those who attend. We're delighted to be able to with the Ashbrook Center to help co-sponsor this and put on this kind of a program for students, teachers, and citizens to take us back to that tumultuous time of 1800 and draw some important lessons for our day in 2020 and the election, but more broadly for lessons of why history matters and how we can do it well.
Forgive me, I had you on mute. Jeff, thank you so much again. This is Jeannie Allen from the Center for Education Reform, and we are so grateful to the Ashbrook Center, Jeff, Dr. Rogers, and our presidents, and particularly our teachers, our educators, Lauren Staton and Christine Ivy. You are singing our song, and there's so much that came out of this and so much great dialogue in the chat talking about the foundations of history. And I think that last point, Mr. Jefferson, about start asking what students are interested in. And to that end, we want to know what teachers are interested in. There are so many great resources and groups like the leaders on this call represent, on this meeting represent, that we want to make available to more and more people. So look at us as sort of helping you with a megaphone. Tell us what else you want to know. Please visit our website, which links to all of the people here, and which you will see not only this video in a day or so that we'll hope you'll also share with perhaps your students. It won't be over their head, I don't think. And then don't forget, we've got a resource database. Tell us what else you want there. We have a Master Teacher Recognition Prize and a student contest. And so again, all these things are just to help all of us grow deeper in a foundation of understanding, and in particular to help us help educators do better and feel more supported, which we do every day. And so thank you again all for joining us. We're grateful, and until next time.